This is Mike Jackson with the ThirdPath Institute. Christopher Veal is an example of someone who has busted through a number of myths, both as a parent and a worker. That too often can keep people feeling trapped. And during this interview with Christopher, you will quickly see how he's used expert skills around vulnerability, trust, empathy, and risk taking to live an integrated life. Over the course of your career, what have you learned that makes work life integration more possible?
There were really two key things I think that stood out that I want to really capture here in this: the themes of flexibility and vulnerability. No surprise with vulnerability, but I want to start with flexibility. For me, I appreciate often senior leaders feel they have the permission and the ability to do it, but people that are maybe lower in the ranks might not. And I know that was especially true for me. Early on in my career, when I got out of the Marine Corps and was starting to work in corporate America, I didn't often see that I could have that flexibility, which was important to me because I was a new father. I had a young child. I was fortunate, though, that I had some leaders that I worked for that really advocated for creating inclusive spaces. And they also modeled flexibility. They were leaders that would take time off to take care of family and do other things. Not only did I hear the leaders saying it, but I got to see them doing it. And so their actions were in alignment with their words, which had me feel safer to say, okay, you know what? I need that time. In 2014, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and I needed to take time off between being a husband and a father and also being a caregiver for my mother and juggling all these things. And I had a boss who was really supportive of me in that. It was powerful because it had me realize, okay, that's something that I deserve and I can ask for. When I became a leader in organizational development work, which that I did, I also got to model that and advocate for it for my people.
How did your flexibility goals influence the choices you made around what work to pursue?
So when I would look at opportunities or jobs that I was going to be considering, one of the questions I would ask them often is, how do they support flexibility for their people? And this is back before we had the pandemic come along. And if the responses I would get were anything less than what felt like they were supportive, I would pass on them. And it meant times that I passed on opportunities for a higher salary, a bigger or better title, because what I knew is that was important to me. But if I didn't feel like I would have the flexibility where sometimes my daughter might get sick and I might need to leave work early, or I have something coming up, can I have some flexible time? The organizations that really supported that were the ones that attracted my attention. It was also something that I made sure that I reinforced for my teams when I was leading them. For me, what it came down to is I started to create this idea of, ultimately, I want to give you autonomy to do what you need to do and still understand what we need to accomplish as a team. And as I saw other leaders start to adopt similar behaviors, it started to create a culture of people feeling supported and less of that, as we talk about sometimes, micromanaging, or that there's someone always looking over your shoulder. If you're trusting your people, they are going to produce results for you.
You mentioned two things that have made work life integration more possible. What was the second factor?
The other big thing that stood out for me was vulnerability. Change requires vulnerability. And some of the most impactful leaders that I've either worked for or worked alongside have been the ones that bring greater levels of vulnerability, willingness to open up and share a little bit more about yourself than you think you typically have to in a professional setting. Well, the impact it created was that people related to their humanity, and it ultimately resulted in greater trust and connection. As organizations are navigating this post-pandemic world, and they're working through issues like remote work versus return to office, what I know is that the willingness for leaders to lean into vulnerability and be willing to create those inclusive workspaces, that's what's going to separate the average organizations from the ones that thrive. And the ones that create those inclusive spaces are going to be the ones that win the battle for talent. They're going to attract and retain that quality talent that's needed going forward.
Any last thoughts about what makes work life integration, including hybrid and remote work, most effective today?
I think the last thing that I want to say about this is that it requires a great level of vulnerability from the leaders to be able to lean into giving their people autonomy. So if anyone's ever read the book Drive from Dan Pink, he talks about autonomy. And I think it's a great, I refer it to a lot of my clients nowadays and say, there's some good learning in there. But what it really means is that we are navigating this new landscape. And a lot of leaders, as was just said, don't know how to lead. How do I manage this when the entire example I had when I was coming through my, leaders might say coming up through their ranks, was leaders being there in person. And so they don't have a new dynamic or a new reference to look at. So part of what we need to do is we need to be patient and support leaders as they're trying to navigate this, but also remind them that it's important to trust in their people. There's been lots of studies done showing that people were as productive, if not more productive, and more satisfied and engaged when they were able to work remotely or have the flexibility. So if we know it works, we need to help them figure out, how do we step past that fear response so that they can take that breath and go, okay, wait a minute. I know that's that fear happening and I know it works. So how do I come in alignment with my people so that we can figure out how do we best work and move forward.